One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
So we're going to do a little bit of a Q&A, and what I've done is I've collected a bunch of questions that I have received over many years, whether that is from my own clients that I coach with one-on-one in my functional medicine programs, or interacting with people on social media, or even actually some of these questions come from the doctors in the seminars that I teach around the country, and they're really just kind of speaking for their own patients when they ask these questions. And what I'll do is I'm going to try to keep this episode down to maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and depending on how wordy I get in my explanations, we may have to split this Q&A up into a couple of different episodes. But what I've done is I've taken this and I've arranged the questions kind of from a general to more specific progression. And so we're going to cover some of the fundamentals first. One of the biggest questions is, how do I know if I have hypothyroidism? And symptomatology is not enough. I think I mentioned this in one of the other episodes, that the classic symptom picture with hypothyroidism, fatigue and weight gain and losing your hair and being cold all the time, sleep problems, depression, brain fog, these can come from other systems. And so we can't rely on the symptom complex alone. There has to be some kind of confirmation from a diagnostic standpoint. Even giving somebody thyroid meds as trial and error and seeing something improve doesn't guarantee that there was a thyroid problem, something that was diagnosable. So what we do from a diagnostic standpoint is we look at blood testing. And there are different types of thyroid disorders that you can diagnose based on different lab patterns. And I'm not going to go through them all because there's quite a handful, but we're just talking about primary hypothyroidism, which is predominantly Hashimoto's disease. But from a lab perspective, primary hypothyroidism is defined as having a laboratory high TSH and a laboratory low T4. Now, I say lab high and lab low just to make a distinction between the laboratory reference ranges, which are pretty standard from lab to lab when it comes to the thyroid panels, as opposed to functional or optimal ranges that I might use in my practice, or that we've taught thousands of doctors to use in their practices, and concepts that you might come across if you're doing your own research out on the internet. Is that you can't diagnose medical conditions with functional ranges. Functional ranges represent what we believe to be optimal physiology, and we can maybe talk about the differences at some other point. But if the question is, how do I know if I have hypothyroidism? If somebody comes to me and they have all the classic symptoms, but their TSH is outside of my functional range, but it's not beyond the lab range, I'm not going to call that hypothyroidism, because using that word brings with it a burden of diagnostic criteria that you have to meet, and those criteria are based on the laboratory reference ranges. That doesn't necessarily mean they don't have an inefficient thyroid system. That's a different question, totally different conversation. So primary hypothyroidism, most of which is Hashimoto's, is a high TSH with a low T4 with reference to the lab range. But there's another kind of subcategory of that medical doctors talk about in conventional medicine, and that is subclinical hypothyroidism, where someone has a high TSH, but their T4 is normal, and typically they have symptomatology. I say typically because not always. And in fact, if you say to somebody, you've got subclinical hypothyroidism, what that means might depend on what's in the mind of the person who's actually using the word subclinical. And so from the conventional mindset, it's really not about the symptoms, it's really just about the numbers. So regardless of whether you have symptoms, if your TSH is high, your T4 is normal, they call that subclinical. And there's a lot of doctors that won't offer medications for that because, after all, the T4 level is normal, even though the TSH is elevated. Now, why is that important? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, it's the T4 level in your bloodstream that operates in a feedback loop with TSH, and they're inversely related, so that when you have enough T4, your TSH is under control. But if your T4 goes down and you become hypothyroid from a hormone production standpoint, then your TSH elevates. And so they kind of look at that as an independent stage or intermediate stage, where the TSH has gone up, but you haven't lost enough T4 to really call it true or primary hypothyroidism. So how do you know you have hypothyroidism? Yeah, symptoms are important, but the better question is, do you qualify for the laboratory criteria? The next question that we often get is, what is the optimal or functional TSH level? Because it's quite interesting, and I've taught, at this point, I've probably taught hundreds of seminars in functional blood chemistry analysis since 2008. And when I first started teaching, the reference range for thyroid, for TSH, the upper limit of normal was typically around 5.5. And a few years after I started lecturing, pretty much across the board, and usually when all labs change the reference ranges, it's because some authority, some board comes out, like the American Thyroid Association or something like that, comes out and makes a statement saying, hey, we believe TSH should be this for this reason. So usually there's some kind of there's a reason for labs to change reference ranges when it's not just based simply on their own calculations. So somewhere along the way, let's call it 2010-ish, most labs started to report the upper limit of normal of TSH to be 4.5, which, to be honest, was a step in the right direction. But in the opinion of most functional doctors, and believe it or not, even in many groups that publish in the medical literature, they didn't go far enough. The American Association of Clinical Endocrinologists and the American Association of Clinical Biochemists published a couple of statements in different papers over several different years, many years ago, at least 10 years ago, saying that every study that we have that shows truly normal thyroid function, like no symptoms, normal thyroid ultrasounds, and normal lab tests, every single person has a TSH that's below 2.75. So usually in the functional seminars that I teach, and what most docs in the functional world use, is an upper limit of normal to represent optimal function of TSH is below 3. Usually we have about 1.6 to 3.0 is the reference range we like to use, and the medical range can go all the way down to 0.45, which is almost non-existent, to be truthful. The reality is there was a lot of debate. There's a lot of debate, and when these papers came out saying, hey, everyone with truly normal thyroid hormone levels have a TSH below 2.75, and that's where we should set the upper limit, there was a big backlash in letters to editors and also in other papers that were published that basically said, hey, if we do that, then everyone's going to have a thyroid issue. And to that, I'm saying, my gosh, well, if everyone does have a thyroid issue, shouldn't we know about it? And so to make these kind of value judgments based on, whether or not it's going to increase the number of cases, if people really truly are suffering with thyroid dysfunction, we should know. We should have a set of diagnostic criteria that cuts through all the crap, so to speak, and really gets to the truth of the matter. Do you have it or do you not? And so optimal TSH level really depends on who you ask. I think that if you shoot for TSH level between 1.6 and 3, you're probably doing pretty okay. But even better so if you've got a TSH below 2.75 or somewhere around there. Now that's not to mean that your TSH is the be-all, end-all of your thyroid hormone assessment. It certainly is not. And in fact, I believe I mentioned in one of the introductory episodes that the literature says that if you've been diagnosed with hypothyroidism and you're on synthetic meds, that TSH and T4 are, in their words, compromised tests, meaning that there is limited clinical utility. And so to make decisions about either medical management or natural approaches based on simply looking at TSH level and even comparing it to the optimal range, it's very one-dimensional and it's very non-utilitarian. There's so much more that needs to be looked at. And on the heels of that one, let's deal with the next very common question, which is, well, if it's not just about my TSH and my T4, what does a full thyroid panel look like? One of the main problems that I and others like me see all the time is that people will come in with labs from their medical doctors, like a GP, an internist, even an endocrinologist. And when it gets to their thyroid, the thyroid portion of their lab tests, you might have a CBC, you might have a what we call a metabolic panel, you have the lipid panel, and then you have thyroid, and it's either just TSH or TSH and T4. That is woefully inadequate to really make any conclusions about the larger picture of the thyroid system. And that's probably the best place to start, is to try to change your mindset that when you look at your thyroid, it's not just about the gland that's in your neck. In fact, you've probably read or heard something like, the thyroid gland is a butterfly-shaped gland in the front of your neck. And that's absolutely true. The problem is your thyroid gland is part of a larger system. In fact, it's called the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid system, or axis, which means the hypothalamus and pituitary in your brain participate. And so the system goes from your brain to your thyroid. Hormones get put into circulation where they interact with enzymes and other tissues and all of your cells, and signals go back to your brain to let your brain know how well the whole thing is doing. And then the brain can adjust production up or down based on the needs of the environment. So it's a much more complicated system. And when I teach this, I break it down into 3 different subcategories. And I actually use this in my own analysis of the thyroid systems of my clients. And it is, we have to look at the system from 3 different perspectives. One is production, how much you're making, and the second one is processing. Once you make hormones or even take them by pill, how is your body handling converting things that are inactive to active forms? And then the final category is what we call proteomics, which is just a fancy word for hormones binding to the receptor and causing some kind of function change in the cell. Really, it means protein replication, but ultimately that's it. So you really have to have a broad spectrum of thyroid tests to figure out exactly where the problems are. Because again, if all you're looking at is your TSH and you're relying on that to make all your decisions, you're basically doing this to a very complicated system where there are more parts. It's very interesting that the vast majority of thyroid tests that are being done, like TSH and T4, are not being done to diagnose hypothyroidism in people who have symptoms, but it's to manage medication of people who have already been diagnosed. Just think about that for a second. The vast majority of thyroid tests for TSH and T4 that are being done are on people where the doctor who's ordering the test is trying to figure out, do they need more or do they not need less? They've been diagnosed already. They're already on thyroid medications. And what that means is that will greatly skew someone's perspective of what the system looks like and the values that go into calculating different reference ranges. So let me answer this question, and then we'll cut this off for this particular episode and pick up the Q&A in the next one. So what does a full thyroid panel looks like? Well, you run enough testing to look at the 3 subcategories of the thyroid system: production, processing, and proteomics. That means looking at TSH and looking not just at total T4, but looking at free T4 as well, looking at T3 and not just T4, looking at free T3 and not just total T3, looking at something called reverse T3, and also looking at the 2 thyroid antibodies that can tell us whether or not someone has an autoimmune reaction, and that would be thyroid peroxidase or antithyroglobulin antibodies. So let me say it one more time. TSH, total T3 and T4, free T3 and T4, reverse T3, and then 2 different thyroid antibodies. Right there, you're looking at 8 different tests, which will allow you to see the entire system. And that, my friend, is what a good thyroid panel looks like. Thank you so much for listening to the Inflammation Nation. If you found this episode valuable, please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so that you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. And why not head over to my main website, drnoseworthy.com, that's drnoseworthy.com, to explore my personalized functional medicine coaching programs, submit a question to the podcast, maybe take a quiz, or even reach out to me using the contact form that you can find there. We'll see you next time.